Brilliant start to fall silent before I'd even ask you to do so. Thank you for being such a disciplined audience at this early stage in the proceedings. May I first introduce myself? I'm Simon Smith. I chair the steering committee of the Ukraine Forum here at Chatham House. And it's an immense pleasure to welcome you all to this latest event that's been conceived and organized by the aforementioned Ukraine Forum. This year is 10 years since the Ukraine Forum here at Chatham House was established, and its objectives then at the outset were to sustain a unique global platform for research and convening on Ukraine, and to ensure that Ukraine and its significance to the wider world were discussed regularly and rigorously, and to ensure that these discussions ranged in inclusivity from the grassroots to heads of state and government, of which we've had many here, and to strategic decision makers. Now, those objectives have not changed, but of course, for more than 3 of those 10 years now, the Forum's focus has been on analysis and understanding of Russia's war against Ukraine from a multiple of perspectives. The Forum has looked regularly and deeply at how the war might end and what consequences that might have. It has looked at different ways of bringing the conflict to an end. But the Forum has also looked at the implications if there's no early end to the war, and what are the feasible actions that might accelerate progress towards an acceptable and sustainable resolution. So today we will talk in various ways about many of those themes. I'm not going to consume valuable time by previewing those themes. You'll see from your agendas what is envisaged for this afternoon's discussions. Just to say that once again to thank in their work supporting the Ukraine Forum over the last 10 years, to thank in particular the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. Indeed, thank them for their participation today, and also to thank the full list of supporters and sponsors of today's conference, who are the Open Societies Foundation, Citibank, and Prevail Partners. Now, before getting us properly underway, just 2 more points about the conduct of this conference. First, to make clear that the conference, and from now up to the conclusion of the first panel discussion, we will be on the record and we're live streaming. After that, we will remain on the record, but we will no longer be live streaming the proceedings of the conference. Secondly, to say, just to give a reminder, if some of you had not noticed, today is the 11th of November, and that, as a great many of you will know, is the day on which in the UK and in many countries around the world, acts of remembrance take place at 11 o'clock for people whose lives have been lost in war. We will accordingly pause this conference at the traditional time of 11 o'clock precisely this morning to observe a silence of 1 minute's duration. But let's now move swiftly on to the opening part of our conference, and I'm delighted to say that we have a senior representative of His Majesty's government here to talk to us today, to get us started, and it's a warm welcome to Alistair Carns, MP, who's the Minister for the Armed Forces in the British Ministry of Defence. Last year, Minister Carns left a military career of immense distinction to start all over again and standing as a candidate for Parliament. He was duly elected as Member of Parliament for Birmingham Selly Oak in last year's general election, and less than a week later was appointed to his first ministerial role in the Ministry of Defence as Minister for Veterans and People. He was appointed to his current job as Minister for Armed Forces in September this year. Minister, thank you very much indeed for sparing the time this morning to talk with us, share your thoughts with us at the start of our day, and can I please invite you to fire away?
Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning to everyone here in Britain or in the English-speaking world, and then Dobry den to everyone in Ukraine. I think it's really important that Chatham House has brought us together today, and from this chance to address you, because I think we have a broad and comprehensive agenda. And I want to begin by paying tribute to the people of Ukraine, who, when faced with Putin's overwhelming aggression, chose to stand up and fight for freedom, and indeed their right to self-determination and for democracy. Today of all days, there is no poignant time to recognize that we like-minded Western-facing nations must stand up and face down tyranny, authoritarianism, and autocracy. Just as the people of Great Britain and our allies stood and fought together 80 years ago, we must support and enable the Ukrainians to do the same. Indeed, as we talk and debate today, by lunchtime in Ukraine and across the Russian front, there will already have been hundreds of casualties in the war in the east. The scale and the barbaric nature are almost incomprehensible in today's world. Hour after hour, day after day, for 3 years, the Ukrainians have fought with incredible courage, determination, and ingenuity. And it's not lost on me, and it won't be lost on many of you, that I believe that will be written into the history books for years to come, that the Ukrainians with Western support have held the line against one of the biggest militaries in the world. A phenomenal effort. So I thought it would be useful to pull out some lessons from the 3 years of conflict so far. And I think it tells us the state of deterrence in Europe in 2022 was broken. We saw increased Russian probing of skies, seas, and cyberspace, and the kind of robust responses we've recently put in place were indeed lacking. Meanwhile, our collective withdrawal from Afghanistan sent a message that the West would not necessarily stand up for freedom and the right to self-determination or democracy that the Ukrainians are fighting so valiantly to uphold. So the lesson here is nothing new. And as a wise person once said, whilst history doesn't repeat itself, it sure does rhyme. The UK and Europe are now standing together more than ever because European security is so interconnected with Ukraine. We collectively are spending more in defence than at any time since the Cold War. More joint exercising, more joint planning, more joint capability development, all are increasing because Ukraine is at the forefront of European security. The steps we take to support Ukraine is making us more secure at home and indeed abroad. United, we are stronger, and what we can do for one, we must do for all. Now, I think the second lesson, after 24 years in the military, and one of the main reasons I left the military and went into politics, was after watching the amazing innovation in Ukraine unfold, I saw that the character of conflict had become unrecognizable. Caught in the military in a hierarchical organization, if I'd wanted to enjoy myself, I would have stayed in the military. But if you want to deliver change, you've got to be in politics. Ukraine, faced with ammunition shortages and stuck in a linear attritional battle, embraced and developed uncrewed systems and different ways of warfare, akin to the introduction of the machine gun for the army, the submarine for the navy, and the jet engine for the air force. Indeed, in a land battle, for the first time since before the First World War, offensive support has been overtaken as the major cause of casualties in war. Significant numbers of casualties in Ukraine are caused by drones. A first-person view drone now equates to 20-plus artillery rounds in lethality and accuracy alone. In the maritime, amazing innovation. A navy without any ships has rendered inoperable one of the biggest fleets in the world. Swarming unmanned surface vessels have restricted the Black Sea Fleet to Novorossiysk and Sevastopol. And in the air, swarms of long-range drones target infrastructure and military sites deep within Russia, as complex air defense and electronic warfare stifle the front in Ukraine. Now, many of you will say that this isn't new. Some will say we'll have the chance to fight differently, and others will argue that there are false lessons that we would fight differently altogether. The reality is people said these same things a year and a half ago, and I would say that you're probably all right. I returned to Ukraine several months ago, and the speed of innovation is utterly outstanding. The Ukrainians are developing and innovating faster than anyone else in the world. And I no longer liken it to the machine gun, the submarine, the jet engine, but to the creation of the Air Force after the First World War. And there's a poignant lesson from history. Who was right? The French, after the First World War, building the Maginot Line, or the Germans developing Blitzkrieg? The truth is that just as the Germans were the only ones to really integrate the Air Force after the First World War with the creation of Blitzkrieg, those that integrate autonomous warfare, data, and quantum into the current ways of fighting will be best prepared for the next conflict. A high-low mix, sophisticated 5th and 6th generation capability mixed with mass hardware and integrated with sophisticated software is indeed the proverbial sweet spot. This very realization drove large parts of our new strategic defence review and the steps we set out to transition to warfighting readiness. The third lesson is that rebuilding European deterrence is about more than just capability. It's more than just autonomy and what our militaries can achieve. It's about what they can sustain. As I've said previously, wars are not won by navies, armies, and air forces. They're won by economies, industries, and societies. That's us, that's me, that's collectively you. And if I was to ask the question of today here in Britain, what have you done to protect our tomorrow, what would you say? Individually and collectively. In these perilous times, too many of us often ask what the nation can do for us, not what we can do for the nation, or indeed what we can do for each other. Now, our Strategic Defence Review and the Defence Industrial Strategy is a blueprint to deliver the innovation and industrial capability needed for a fast-evolving modern warfare. That's why the first 100 pages of that SDR are laser-focused on allies and industries, rebuilding our industrial base, developing a whole-of-society approach, and preparing our nation to be able to deter, but if necessary, absorb strategic shock. All of these lessons either relearned from the Cold War or learned from our indomitable allies in Ukraine. Now, the fourth lesson, as a wise leader once said, the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. As I'm among experts, I won't sugarcoat the obvious. Yes, for too long, Europe has not contributed enough to NATO deterrence in its own backyard. Yes, we hope any changing US focus towards Europe is calibrated very carefully. But it's also true that whilst recent efforts to initiate a peace process could have not happened without Ukrainian resistance and European resolve, they ultimately happen because of the intervention of President Trump. The UK continues to lead more than 30 nations in the coalition that are willing to support this process, so that in the event of a ceasefire, we can strengthen Ukraine's path to peace and stability by developing a multinational force for Ukraine to secure Ukrainian skies, secure safer seas, and regenerate Ukraine's armed forces. Multinational force planning was discussed by the Prime Minister at the coalition meeting in London earlier this month, attended by President Zelensky. Command structures have long been agreed, reconnaissance missions to Ukraine have been completed, and the defence sector has accelerated funding. Now, this is all to ensure the UK force and contingent is ready to go and our European allies ready to follow. But we're really realistic. Russia has taken more casualties than the United States took in the entire Second World War, and are inching forward at a rate that arguably represents strategic failure. However, Putin shows no sign of stopping voluntarily. So as our Prime Minister, together with President Zelensky and 11 other prominent European leaders, made clear, following Putin's last rejection of President Trump's diplomacy, we must ramp up pressure. We must double down on the pressure on Russian economy and its defense industry, and put Ukraine in the very, very best, strongest possible position before, during, and after any ceasefire. So we warmly welcome that the US mirrored our recent sanctions against Russia's two largest oil producers, Rosneft and Lukoil, and we encourage them to do more. And that the EU has also further strengthened its sanctions regime. And we and our allies, united as one, continue to give Ukraine all of the support we can on the battlefield, and we continue to champion to do more. We've used interest from immobilised Russian sovereign assets to increase the UK's military aid package to £4.5 billion this year. We've invested £600 million this year to arm Ukrainian forces with a variety of drones, and that's gone from 10,000 in 2024 to 100,000 in 2025. At the recent Coalition the Willing meeting, the Prime Minister announced that we would continue to provide Ukraine with long-range deep effectors, and we've also extended operational Interflex until at least the end of 2026, which is the multinational training operation that has now trained over 60,000 Ukrainian personnel. And as a demonstration that the whole of Europe has stepped up in terms of military support to Ukraine, in the 8 months since the UK took on the role as a co-chair of the Ukrainian Defence Contact Group, we've raised international pledges of military aid totaling over $50 billion. But we must do more. And because Ukrainian resistance has been so heroic and valiant, it has turned a war Russia thought it would win on the battlefield into a war of production. We've also greatly intensified our support for and collaboration with Ukrainians' defense industries. We've entered a new technological sharing agreement with the Ukrainian government and an industrial partnership to co-develop an advanced new air defense interceptor drone, which is the first of many. And I would say the more that we can do, the faster our technological and industrial base will increase in tandem with the Ukrainians. But that cooperation will boost our respective capabilities for British jobs. And building on the recent 200 million investment in around East Anglia by one of Ukraine's biggest drone manufacturing companies, we're leading the way. But we want more UK-Ukraine collaboration. We want more joint ventures. We want more cooperation at the industrial level so we can speed up our industrial capacity and deliver the best drones. And importantly, as war is always the mother of innovation, we must benefit and learn from Ukrainians' lessons in the conflict. Now, this has demonstrated how we're supporting Ukraine and rebuilding European deterrence together with Ukraine. Not only makes us more secure at home, but of course, abroad. But it can also be an engine for growth and jobs across the UK. Now, Ukraine matters to every person in the United Kingdom because Ukrainian and European security is our security, and it's often lost on our population. If Putin opts for a long overdue ceasefire, we will continue to lead the coalition that are willing to establish credible deterrence in Ukraine, and the UK will lead that. And if that's not forthcoming, we will continue working with allies to put Ukraine in the strongest possible position by upping military support and upping the pressure on Putin's war machine. And in both instances, we will work to rebuild the credibility of military deterrence across the whole of Europe, both militarily and, importantly, industrially. It's a plan to face down continued Russian aggression and a plan, inevitably, which will end in peace. It's a plan that depends on partnership. It's a plan that will help Ukraine prevail, but only if we as Ukrainians' allies mirror the exact resolve, the courage and the determination that Ukrainian demonstrates every day. Now, the UK, day of all days, knows what it's like to stand against tyranny, sometimes alone. So to Ukraine, all the soldiers, sailors, and airmen, the population, and the politicians, the UK stands unequivocally with you side by side. Slava Ukraini.
Minister, thank you so much for kicking us off with such an inspiring set of thoughts and convictions right at the outset. It won't surprise you to hear that there are a number of things which I'm sure the audience would like us to explore a little bit more deeply. And I'd like to start by asking you a question about how it has looked and felt since Donald Trump has got involved in all this. From the beginning of this year. It is occasionally commented, perhaps more than occasionally commented, that somehow Trump's interventions, Trump's engagements with Putin and with Zelensky and his meetings and his phone calls and so on has produced a series of vacillations, of kind of indecisions. And there's a bit of talk to the effect that the governments of Europe are sitting around and while they try and cope with Trump's vacillations, there's a sense that the impetus has rather been lost. It would be understandable in the sense that there's that rather large part of the picture which has a bit of a question mark over it. Which way is Trump going to go? But would you agree that that has resulted in a loss of momentum in planning in Europe? I'm expecting you'll say no, but I'm looking forward to your answer as to how it looks from your perspective.
Well, let's just start with say that any negotiation must have Ukraine at its very heart. Ukraine owns and controls its destiny, and other people can help get there, but Ukraine must be central to any negotiation. And I think we've seen that with multiple meetings between Trump, Zelensky, and other European leaders. What we've got to accept, and I said it in my speech, is that the West has been too overly reliant on US support for its own security in the past. And what in reality what that means is that we've collectively disinvested in our industrial base. That industrial base is more important now than ever before when it comes to supporting Ukraine in particular. That's why you see within the SDR and across Europe a huge amount of money going into, yes, weapons and systems, but primarily the infrastructure and the ecosystem of defense industry, because that lies at the heart to sustain a long war. I personally think the strategy that must be adopted is fight and talk. So absolutely fight 110%, gain the best position that Ukraine can, and then continue to talk to find a negotiated peace with Ukraine at the very heart of it. And the momentum of Trump coming into this, the negotiations, is driving negotiations. I don't think from my perspective in Europe, especially from a UK lead, you've actually seen an increase from this government with the coalition, the willing, looking to pragmatic solutions that can help find that very difficult solution of finding an acceptable peace in Ukraine. And so I would say momentum has increased. Defense spending's increased, industrial pressures increased, and a lot of that comes from, whether we like it or not, Trump's involvement in this negotiation and debate.
Thanks very much. Could I press you a little bit further on what is going on in terms of planning? I mean, I think you've given I think a very positive, reassuring answer to that question about have we all simply sort of sat there and waited till Trump makes his mind up? Clearly not. But what's the thinking on how Europe, even in the absence of full or possibly even more difficult than that, in the absence of full US engagement, what is the European plan to provide for a secure future for Ukraine? What work is going on what a security guarantee for Ukraine looks like in the future?
This is the coalition of willing. The Prime Minister, met with Zelensky the other day, and 11 nations have talked through it. You've got 30 nations on board, and this is about the UK primarily, with France, leading that coalition that looks to set together security guarantees for Ukraine should there be a negotiated peace. And that primarily is around safe skies, safer seas, and the regeneration of Ukrainian armed forces capability, so this can never happen again. That work is ongoing. The Prime Minister met with Zelensky. The Americans have been briefed on it, and it's moving forward at pace. What we've got to do is ensure that Ukraine has the fighting wherewithal, the capability, the industrial capacity, the weapon systems to continue to check Russia and bring about a negotiation.
So you've talked about particularly that focus on military capacity. You've talked about fighting and talking. Let's talk a little bit about fighting. So tell us a little bit about how, from your perspective, you see military strategy, our military strategy in support of Ukraine as we look forward or as we look ahead to the war continuing.
Yeah, so it's our number one priority is the support to Ukraine at the moment, whether that be interflex and training Ukrainian forces to fight, whether that be working across the country across the world to buy weapon systems to provide Ukraine, to give them the sustenance to fight, or whether that be at the diplomatic level, rallying Europe and keeping people and pushing them forward. If we look back on the history of Ukraine, UK has been at the very forefront. I think in my whole military career, it's the only time we in 24 years have led everybody, including the Americans, whether that be the introduction of the tank, whether that be the first missiles landing on the airfield, whether that be through the development of multinational bodies such as the Coalition of the Willing. So I'm really proud of what the UK has done, but I will be really honest, we've got to do more, and we're pushing as hard as we can to do that. And a lot of it, let's be honest, is based around our industrial base and delivering more weapon systems for Ukraine in a conflict that we haven't seen since the Second World War. In some cases, 10 to 16,000 artillery rounds used a day. There are 5,000 FPV drones a day being fought. The sustainment level of that is huge. And Europe is really mobilizing now to get after it.
Thank you. And let's stick a little bit with the military picture. You've talked quite a lot in your speech about quite a number of innovations that we've seen while the war in Ukraine has gone on. But what do you think are the most important military lessons that we've learned from the war in Ukraine? And I wonder if you could include in that as well what we've learned from the way in which energy infrastructure is made such a clear object of pursuing the war. And I think it could be observed that, in a sense, we've seen a lot more of that from Russia in terms of targeting energy infrastructure. Mm-hmm. But do you see a case for looking more seriously at the way in which Russian infrastructure can also be something that's put into play, that's added to the list of doubts and uncertainties on the Russian side, and therefore in turn is added to the pressures that we can bring to bear on Russia, to the costs of war, which we will hope eventually will bring Russia to a point where it cannot sustain those costs?
Yeah. I think the point of who can sustain the most the longest is critical. And I mean that into Europe as well. And what I would say is, Europe's ability to absorb the pressure of this conflict in Ukraine is infinitum. On the other side, Russia's taken over 1 million casualties. I mean, that is more casualties than America took in the entire Second World War. How long can it sustain that? How long can it continue to convince its people that it is doing the right thing with that amount of casualties? Whereas Europe is building up its industrial base in 3 to 5 to 10-year programs across every country in Europe. So the momentum is building. The juggernaut is building in Europe when it comes to defense industry. And I think that's got a signal to Russia and any other adversaries that Europe has awoken, and Ukraine has helped us with that. When we talk about lessons in Ukraine, I can preach for quite a while on this, but the Ukraine, we have an institutional arrogance sometimes in the West to think that we know best. The reality is the Ukraine and war is the mother of all innovation, and they have innovated on a different level of where uncrewed systems now are dominating the battlefield. And I say that the lesson here is hardware that can be sustained at a rate of conflict, at the rate the conflict demands, major war, and then very sophisticated software that can be used across all of those systems to provide a networked approach that's harnesses data and in the future, quantum. And I think we are seeing a whole change in the character of conflict. Nature of conflict never changes, but the character is changing. And I go back to the Germans, integrated Air Force, great blitzkrieg, whoever integrates autonomous weapon systems most effectively will be ready for the next one.
Thank you. We've talked a lot about preparedness. You mentioned in your speech that it was one of the objectives of the British government to ensure that Ukraine was in the strongest position for whatever comes down the line in terms of negotiation, in terms of being put on the spot to look at various outcomes of the war, decide which are the ones it can live with, which ones it can't. But let's look for a minute at the possibility, and it's a real possibility, that for the foreseeable future there is no kind of meeting ground, let alone sort of common ground, if you like, identified that really provides the basis for a serious negotiation. Let's look at a near-term future in which Putin will not engage seriously and realistically in a peace process. Where in that situation do you see the conflict going in the near term? What might we expect in terms of, will it be the same as before, grinding on pretty much as we've seen over the last year or so? Do you envisage new developments, surprises, different turns in the balance of forces deployed, different turns in the momentum generated by either side in the conflict? How does it look?
So it's very dangerous for anyone to predict the future of conflict, or indeed how a battle may turn. And the only people who will be able to decide that are the Ukrainians and the Russians. What I would say is that Europe will fully support Ukraine in whatever turn it takes to hold the line and defend the freedoms that their people enjoy. It's the war of national survival for Ukraine. The last time the UK has felt that is during 1941, during the Battle of Britain. What a poignant day to talk about it. We haven't felt that since. And so we've got to empathise with the Ukrainians. They're fighting for national survival. They're fighting for their families, they're fighting for their people, they're fighting for their homes, their property. And so we support the Ukrainians to do whatever it takes to hold that line. And I would say that some of the long-range strikes they're doing are very effective. an imposing cost. The casualty rates from a Russian perspective are absolutely huge, and they've got to hold the line to bring about peace in due course. I think it'd be very difficult for me to predict.
Fair enough.
What's going to happen?
Fair
It's a
enough.
dangerous game, that one.
Let's move on a little bit to just to look at and perhaps challenge an assumption or a belief which again is not universally held but which surfaces quite regularly. And we had someone on the platform here at Chatham House a week or so ago who said, I think I'm quoting him accurately, he said, "It's a pity that the only thing that European governments fear more than the defeat of Ukraine is a defeat for Russia." And what he was implying, I think, was that there's been a sort of inhibition in the government supporting Ukraine. There's been a sort of, let's help a little bit with this, let's help in incremental ways, let's see if that will be enough, and let's hope it is, but let's not kind of push things too far, let's not turn too many tables over. And I think what he is implying, and what is implied in this in this kind of question, is that there is some kind of inhibition. That there's a sort of fear that if you push Russia too far, that goodness knows what might happen in terms of either catastrophe in Russia itself or in terms of Russian reaction. How do you respond to that sort of question, to the implication that our governments in Europe are too inhibited, are too risk-averse, if you like, in their responses to Russia?
I think early on in the conflict, it's straight out the Russian playbook. And if you go Second World War, when the Germans invaded Russia, Russia dismantled this industrial base, moved it east of the Urals, re-established it, and then outproduced Germany. What Putin has done is threaten nuclear escalation, God knows how many times, made sure America stays out of the conflict while it's mobilized its industrial base to come back and really, fight on the front line. It's exactly the same as what they did in the Second World War. And the reality is, I think the attritional conflict is having a significant cost on Russia. How do you deter a country that's taken 1 million casualties and still isn't deterred? Where is the tipping point for Russia? And you can see some of that in Russia at the moment. You can see there's been some protests, there's the financial issue is becoming significant within Russia itself. When is the tipping point? We've got to keep pushing, we've got to hold the line and go all in. And I think there's no doubt within the UK and our European allies to do that. And that's why you're seeing this massive investment in defence spending, which a large proportion of it, and the product of that industrial base build, will go to Ukraine. And if you're with the other side of the line in Russia and you're looking at this huge build going within Europe, you've got to acknowledge that over time, when it comes to bring to bear, that it will outproduce Russia.
Thank you. Let's, I think, probably finish with a question that's more sort of broadly to do with, I think, comes back to what you said about the population obviously having a stake in what's going on, but obviously having a role, having a duty, what you said about people asking what they can do for this defence effort. And I'd like to ask, what is your assessment of the public mood in Britain about all this? I was interested to hear you talk about whatever it takes, which seems to me to be good progress from the slogan that was around earlier in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, which was that we will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes. And I always felt that as long as it takes carried a sort of intent to turn a switch on in the public's mind, to say this could actually take quite a long time. So the message there is not a useless one, it's actually quite a useful one. It's one that says, don't expect this to be over tomorrow. You need to stick with it. We will need some staying power if we want to get the result that we need. But I also understood why a lot of people felt that as long as it takes was really not quite enough. It wasn't saying enough and it wasn't doing enough. And it was saying, we'll be there for as long as it takes, but implied, we're not quite sure what it takes and we hope it doesn't take too much. So to hear you talk about saying, we will do whatever it takes, I think is progress and it's encouraging. But of course, the crucial thing about that is what it means in practice. And I'm interested in how, as an elected MP, how you see that public attitudes in the UK, and I think a lot of those will be mirrored elsewhere in Europe, how they've evolved as the war has gone on, and to what extent do you judge that your electorate, that the populations of Europe are ready for this war, are ready for the role that they have to play in it, are ready for, in a sense, the sacrifices they have to make in order to drive this conflict to an acceptable conclusion, and that they are, in a sense, ready to take on the burdens that implies when and as and when we do, as you say, whatever it takes to get the right result.
So I think the first point is, now as the Veterans Minister before I came into this job, was in British population today, you're more likely to know a veteran than you are someone in the armed forces. And what I mean by that is the division between the military and the population today is bigger than it's ever been. And so if you were to ask your average person on the street, do you know someone, a veteran or someone in the military, they may not know. Their probably quickest reference to the military and what it takes, whatever it takes, will be a film that they've watched. And that's quite a dangerous place to be in the current geopolitical environment that we're in as well. And so part of the Strategic Defence Review was ensuring that armed forces education about armed forces is taught in schools, the cadet expansion, and really trying to increase the tentacles of defence into society to demonstrate, one, what defence can do for society, but also what society can do for the defence of the nation. And so building that bond back together is really important. The second one is about articulating the threats. And in the past, we haven't been, for 10 years, we haven't been really good at articulating what does the war in Ukraine really mean for the UK? Well, it's the biggest contributor to the cost of living crisis. But if you were to ask your average person on the street, they wouldn't associate the war in Ukraine to the cost of living crisis. Now, there's no attribution around Jaguar Land Rover, but Jaguar Land Rover bailout was 1.5 billion. That's half the two-child benefit cap. That's putting millions of children in poverty. So when we talk about warfare or welfare, we've got to acknowledge that if we don't have a very strong deterrence and defence, that actually your ability to affect your welfare is significant. And so I think it's on us to really explain to the population the implications of conflicts that seem quite far away, but can have a huge effect on our economic sustainability and balance here in the UK. And if we don't do that, we're going to have a difficult argument politically and where stretched finances go in the UK as a whole. My view is whatever it takes to support Ukraine, for the simple reason that if, and I don't think it will happen, but if Ukraine were to fail, it will cost us much more. And so this is a spend to save programme. So let's double down and support Ukraine as we have been doing, and the Prime Minister and John Healey have been absolutely stalwart behind this, do everything we can, whatever it takes to support Ukraine, because fighting at the front will stop us having to fight should things go the wrong way.
Minister, I'm looking at the clock above your head and I'm conscious that your time is precious and that you need to move on. But I want to thank you very much indeed for joining us this morning, for getting our conference off to a thought-provoking and exciting start. Could you give, please, Mr. Carns, a round of applause?